They told her to keep her hands where they could see them, and she did, because that's what 30 years of discipline teaches a person. But the men who pulled her over had no idea they were about to find out exactly who she was. The frost hadn't fully lifted off the windshield when Eleanor Bramfield O.C. pulled out of the church parking lot in Moncton, New Brunswick. Her husband Desmond beside her in the passenger seat, a tray of his mother's jollof rice balanced carefully on his knees. It was the second Sunday of November, the kind of grey Atlantic morning that made the heater in their Lincoln Aviator work overtime, and they were headed to a remembrance dinner at the Legion Hall to honour the veterans in their family, a tradition they'd kept for 11 years running. Desmond hummed along to the gospel station, tapping his thumb against the dashboard. Eleanor, 68, drove with both hands on the wheel, and her reading glasses pushed up into her silver-streaked hair, the same calm, unhurried posture she'd carried since she retired from 31 years as a hospital administrator. The car wasn't flashy, it was practical, paid off, leased a long time ago and bought out years later. But it was new enough, clean enough, and large enough that it caught the eye of Constable Wade Pruitt, who was parked behind a hedge on Mountain Road, nursing a coffee gone cold and looking for something to do on an otherwise dead shift. "That's a nice rig for a Sunday drive," Pruitt said to his partner, Constable Riley Strand, a younger officer, barely 2 years out of depot, still eager to prove he belonged. "Run the plate. For what reason?" Strand asked, half joking, half serious. "For the reason that I said so," Pruitt replied, already pulling out behind them. He didn't wait for the plate to come back. He flipped the lights on before the query even finished loading on his terminal, and the cruiser's red and blue glow filled Eleanor's mirrors before she'd even processed what was happening. "Lord," Desmond murmured, sitting up straighter, instinctively smoothing the jollof rice tray as though that might matter. "We weren't going fast, were we?" "I had it right at the limit," Eleanor said, easing onto the shoulder, her heartbeat climbing despite every ounce of composure she tried to summon. She had grown up in Halifax in the 70s. She knew what these stops could become, knew it in the part of her body that remembered before her mind caught up. "Keep calm, Day. Hands where they can see them." Pruitt swaggered up to the window the way men do when they've decided the outcome before they've asked a single question. He didn't greet her. He tapped the glass with 2 knuckles, hard, and waited for her to roll it down before he even looked at her properly. "License and registration." "Of course, officer. May I ask why I was stopped?" "You'll get your answer when I get my documents." Eleanor reached slowly into her purse, narrating each motion the way she'd learned decades ago. "I'm reaching for my wallet now. It's right here," and handed over her ID with steady hands. Pruitt studied it far longer than necessary, glancing between her face and the photo, then leaned down to get a better look at Desmond. "This your car?" "It's registered to my husband and me jointly," Eleanor answered. "We've had it 3 years. "Funny," Pruitt said, "because we've had reports of a vehicle matching this description involved in a break-and-enter ring working the Riverview area. Older couple, nice SUV, moving stolen electronics." It was a lie invented on the spot, the kind of lie that requires no paperwork and no consequence unless someone bothers to check. There had been no such reports. There was no ring. There was only a man who had decided, the instant he saw 2 black faces behind the wheel of a vehicle he considered above their station, that something must be wrong. "That's not us," Desmond said evenly. "We're on our way to a remembrance dinner. There's a tray of food right here. You're welcome to look." "I didn't ask you to speak," Pruitt snapped. "Out of the vehicle, both of you." "Officer, with respect, is that necessary?" Eleanor asked. "We've answered. Out. Now." Strand, hovering near the passenger door, looked uncertain, but said nothing, the way rookies do when their training officer's confidence overrides their own judgment. Eleanor stepped out first, smoothing her good wool coat, standing as straight as her hip would allow after the replacement surgery 2 years back. Desmond followed, setting the tray gently on the passenger seat first, his jaw tight but his voice still even. "Hands on the vehicle," Pruitt ordered. "Sir, my wife has a hip implant." Standing bent, hands on the vehicle. Eleanor complied, palms flat against the cold metal of the hood, the chill seeping through her gloves. Cars slowed as they passed on Mountain Road, a few phones lifting to film, none of them stopping to ask questions, all of them assuming, because that's what a scene like this trains people to assume, that the couple bent over the hood must have done something. Whose idea was the Aviator? Pruitt asked, circling them slowly, his tone almost conversational now, the way a cat toys before it commits. Bit much for a retired nurse, isn't it? I was a hospital administrator, Eleanor said quietly. For 31 years. Sure you were. Pruitt smirked at Strand. And I bet you'll tell me your son's a doctor next. My son is a major in the Canadian Armed Forces, Eleanor said. And for the first time her voice had an edge to it, not fear but something sharper. He bought half this vehicle as a gift when he made rank. If you'd like, you can call him. Pruitt laughed, the dry, performative laugh of a man who has decided nothing said to him will be believed. A major, right, and I'm the Prime Minister. He turned to Desmond, who had begun to lower his arm slightly, his shoulder aching from the position. Did I say you could move? My shoulder, hands on the hood. Pruitt grabbed Desmond's wrist and forced it back into place, harder than necessary, and Desmond winced audibly. Eleanor's head snapped up. There's no cause for that, she said. He has a rotator cuff injury. He told you, ma'am, I will cuff you for interference if you say one more word. It was at that moment, 11 minutes into a stop that should never have happened, that a black pickup truck, mud-spattered and oversized, pulled onto the shoulder behind the cruiser with a controlled, deliberate stop, no screech, no drama. The engine cut off, the door opened. The man who stepped out was built like he'd spent 20 years being measured against a standard most people never meet. 6'3", shoulders like a doorway, a green field jacket zipped to the throat, his hair cut close, and his bearing unmistakably, undeniably military. He didn't run. He walked with the kind of pace that makes people without authority feel, suddenly and without knowing why, that they are standing in the presence of someone who has it. Sir, get back in your vehicle, Strand called out, finding his voice for the first time. This is an active stop. The man kept walking, his eyes on the two figures bent over the hood of the aviator. I said get back. That's my mother, the man said, and the temperature of the conversation changed entirely. And that's my father. Take your hands off him. Pruitt's hand drifted toward his belt, more reflex than thought. Stop right there, or you'll be joining them. The man stopped exactly 5 feet away, unhurried, and reached slowly into his jacket, prompting Strand to half-draw his sidearm with a panicked, hands, before producing not a weapon but a leather folio, which he opened and held up at eye level. Major Anders Okwuosa, Canadian Armed Forces, 5th Canadian Division, he said, his voice low and absolutely level. That's my mother you've got bent over a hood in the cold, and the man you just wrenched by the bad shoulder is my father, who has 3 herniated discs from 30 years working the docks in St. John. Take the cuffs off them right now. Pruitt studied the ID the way a man studies something he's hoping will turn out to be fake. Anyone can print a card, he said, and tossed the folio onto the gravel at Anders' feet. Anders didn't blink. He didn't bend to retrieve it. Pick it up. Excuse me? That is Government of Canada property. You just threw it in the dirt. Pick it up. Strand, sweating now despite the cold, looked between the two men. Wade, maybe we just call it in, confirm the ID, if he's really a… Shut up, Strand. Pruitt's composure was cracking at edges, the performance starting to slip. He's obstructing. Aggressive posture, refusing officer commands. I haven't moved an inch, Anders said. You're threatening me. I'm informing you, Anders corrected, that my mother gave 41 years of her life to this country between the hospital and raising 3 children alone for 2 of those years, while my father worked away on contract. And you have had her standing in the cold, with her hands on a hood for 11 minutes, because you decided, the moment you saw her face, that she didn't belong in this vehicle. Pruitt's jaw worked. He looked at the gathering of slowed cars, the phone still recording, and made the decision that men like him always make when cornered. Not retreat, but escalation. I smell cannabis in that vehicle, he announced. That gives me grounds to search. It was the oldest lie in the book, deployed the way it always is. A magic phrase that, once spoken, supposedly grants permission for anything that follows. There is no cannabis in that car, Eleanor said, from the hood, her voice tight with fury now rather than fear. There is a tray of my mother-in-law's jollof rice and a wreath for the cenotaph. Strand, you smell it too, don't you? Pruitt pressed, the way he always pressed rookies who hadn't yet learned to say no. Strand looked at the tray visible through the open door, looked at Eleanor's good wool coat, looked at the small Remembrance Day pin on Desmond's lapel. And something in him, not courage exactly, but the beginning of it, made him hesitate long enough that the silence answered the question for him. You should know, Anders said into that hesitation, tapping the heavy watch on his wrist, that this is recording audio and transmitting live to a secure server as of the moment I parked, and that my mother's phone, in her coat pocket, has been on an open line to a number that logs and timestamps everything you've said for the last 11 minutes. You're bluffing. Search the car and find out, Anders said. Tear it apart, looking for something that isn't there. But understand that the moment you do, this stops being a conversation between you and a sergeant and starts being a conversation with the JAG office and the Civilian Review Directorate. Pruitt hesitated exactly long enough for the hesitation itself to become a kind of answer, and then, because men who have built a career on bullying rarely know how to back down gracefully, he doubled down instead. Cuff him, he told Strand, gesturing at Anders. Obstruction. What happened over the next 40 minutes would later be reconstructed, second by second, in a courtroom, but in the moment, it unfolded with the chaotic speed of a small town's worst day. More cruisers arrived, lights stacking against the grey sky. A sergeant named Holt Bannerman, 30 years on the force, thick through the middle, and unbothered by most things, climbed out of his SUV, demanding to know why half the detachment was parked on Mountain Road, for what looked like a routine stop. Stopped a vehicle matching a B&E description, Pruitt told him, words tumbling faster than they should. Then this guy comes flying up, starts making threats, flashing ID. I am Major Anders Okuoza, Anders said, cuffed, now, but standing with a stillness that made the cuffs look like someone else's problem. Currently being unlawfully detained, while my 68-year-old mother stands in freezing temperatures with a hip implant, and my father's shoulder is re-injured by your officer. Bannerman looked at Eleanor, finally allowed to stand upright, rubbing her wrist where the metal had bitten in. He looked at Desmond, grey-faced and breathing carefully through what was clearly real pain. Something in Bannerman's gut, the part of a 30-year cop that still occasionally worked, told him this didn't look right. Pruitt. Get her off the hood. Get him a chair if he needs one. But Sarge, he was. I said stand them up. It was in that pause, that small crack of doubt opening in Bannerman, that Pruitt made his fatal decision. He went back to the open SUV, rifled through the trunk with theatrical thoroughness, and emerged 30 seconds later holding up a small black handgun by the trigger guard. Found it, he announced, his voice rising in triumph, wedged behind the spare. Serials filed off. Eleanor's knees nearly buckled. That is not ours. We have never seen that weapon in our lives. Unregistered firearm, Pruitt said, grinning now. The performance fully restored. Looks like everyone's coming in. Anders closed his eyes for one long breath, the way he'd been trained to do before delivering a verdict he already knew was correct. Constable, he said, you've made a mistake. The only mistake, Pruitt sneered. Is your mother driving a car like this through a town like this? The mistake, Anders said, opening his eyes, is that you don't know this vehicle. The 2023 Aviator doesn't have a recessed spare tire well. It has a flat composite floor over the battery pack for the hybrid system and a sealant kit. There is no cavity back there to wedge anything into, which means that gun was never in that trunk until you put it there. The silence that followed had weight to it. Bannerman walked to the trunk himself, lifted the carpet, found exactly what Anders described. A flat foam panel with no space for anything, let alone a handgun shoved deep enough to require 30 seconds of searching. Pruitt, Bannerman said slowly. Where exactly did you find this? It was wedged in the kit. I meant the kit. You said the spare, Anders said quietly. Sarge, Strand said, his voice shaking now. I saw him take something out of his vest before he leaned into that trunk. I didn't want to say anything. You lying little. Pruitt spun on him, and in that single unguarded motion, the entire fabrication came apart in front of a sergeant, a recording watch, an open phone line, and a small crowd of onlookers who had stopped filming traffic and started filming history. Bannerman drew his own weapon, more out of procedure than fear, and ordered Pruitt to drop the planted firearm. Pruitt's hand shook. He looked at Anders, standing motionless and unbothered, a monument to the discipline Pruitt had never possessed. He looked at the small crowd. He looked, finally, at the consequence of every shortcut he'd ever taken, arriving all at once. The gun clattered to the asphalt. Within the hour, a grey government sedan pulled up behind the cruisers, and a woman in the dress uniform of the Office of the Judge Advocate General stepped out, having been on the open line with Eleanor's phone the entire time, every word logged and time-stamped. 2 investigators from the RCMP's Serious Incident Unit followed her out. Pruitt was placed in cuffs of his own. His own cuffs, in fact, the same pair he'd used on Anders, and led to a cruiser under a charge sheet that would grow considerably longer in the months ahead. What came out over the following weeks? Through a rookie constable who finally found the courage, Strand had been missing on the roadside, was worse than a single bad stop. Pruitt had been running a quiet pattern for years, pulling over vehicles that didn't match their drivers in his estimation, manufacturing probable cause, and steering seized property toward a tow operator who happened to be his brother-in-law. There was a ledger. There were other victims. A young Filipino nurse who'd lost her car for 6 weeks over a search that turned up nothing. An indigenous contractor whose truck was impounded twice in 1 year. A university student whose scholarship savings vanished into asset forfeiture proceedings that were never properly filed. The trial, when it came, was held in Moncton's federal courthouse the following spring, and it drew more attention than anyone in that small jurisdiction had expected. Eleanor sat in the front row in a navy dress, her hip finally healed enough that she no longer needed the cane. Desmond sat beside her, his shoulder in a sling from the surgery the injury eventually required. Anders sat at the end of the row in his service uniform, a silent, unmoving reminder of exactly who had been wronged and why it mattered. The Crown prosecutor, a sharp, unhurried woman named Priscilla Banerjee, built her case not around a single bad afternoon but around a pattern. The ledger, the testimony of the rookie, the financial trail to the impound lot, the dashboard audio recovered from Pruitt's own cruiser in which he could be heard, weeks before the Okwuosa stop, telling another officer that, "You find the crime where the money is, and the money's wherever they can't prove they belong." The jury did not need long. 12 days of testimony ended in under 3 hours of deliberation, and the verdict, when it came, was guilty on every count. Evidence tampering, assault, fraud, deprivation of rights, racketeering. The judge, reading the sentence, looked directly at Pruitt rather than at his notes. "You were given a badge to protect the people who couldn't protect themselves," she said. "And you turned it into a license to hunt them. The court does not take this lightly." 18 years, with restitution ordered to every victim the investigation had uncovered, their savings and dignity to be repaid, as far as money could repay either. It would be easy to end the story there, with the gavel and the sentence, but the Okwuosa family had never been people who measured a win by someone else's loss. The following autumn, on a quiet street in Riverview, just across the bridge from Moncton, a modest brick building opened its doors with a small sign out front. The Eleanor and Desmond Okwuosa Community Justice Center. Free legal aid for anyone who couldn't afford a lawyer, staffed in part by reservist JAG officers and local advocates, funded by the settlement the family had never wanted to need. Desmond, Kane retired to the front hall closet, liked to sit on the porch in the evenings now, watching the street, watching the cars pass without the old tightness in his chest. Eleanor still made jollof rice every Sunday, though these days there was usually enough to feed whoever showed up at the community centre that week. And Anders, home on leave more often than his deployment schedule should technically allow, would sit beside his father with 2 coffees and not say much, because by then there wasn't much that needed saying. What happened on Mountain Road that grey November morning was never really about a car or a tray of rice, or even, in the end, about one constable's broken sense of who deserved respect. It was about what happens when the people who are supposed to protect us decide instead to prey on us, and what happens when the people they choose to prey on turn out to have more strength, more dignity, and more reach than anyone bothered to imagine. Eleanor and Desmond Okwuosa didn't just clear their names. They built something that will outlast the men who tried to take their dignity from them on the side of a Canadian highway. So ask yourself, the way this family had to ask themselves that morning, when the moment comes, will you stand there in silence, or will you be the one who picks up the phone, who speaks up, who refuses to let it happen quietly? Because somewhere out there, right now, someone is bent over a hood who shouldn't be. And the only thing that changes that is people who decide they've had enough. Tell us in the comments what you would have done if you were Anders. And if this story moved you, hit subscribe, because justice like this deserves to be heard.